Each year, a university has the privilege to acknowledge moments of great significance. Annually, on a sunny day in May, 5,000 students graduate from KU, and the university sends them forth amidst noble rhetoric and exalted purpose. Almost every month, it seems, we dedicate new buildings or acknowledge gifts that enable the institution to move forward. One day, it's a new laboratory. Another day, it's a powerful new imaging installation that performs medical miracles. We're also privileged, as you know, to have a steady stream of distinguished visitors, ranging from foreign presidents to cabinet officials to visiting scholars, all of whom grace our campus and challenge our thinking. But it's rare indeed to have a visitor of the importance that we have tonight, a writer whose work demands respect not just because of its profound meaning, but also because it has been created with great courage in the very face of threats to the author's life. Salman Rushdie is, quite simply, the most famous living writer in the world. His work attempts nothing less than trying to explain East to West and West to East. If globalization is our condition, then Rushdie is the poet laureate of the globe's immigrants. As he describes himself, he's an immigrant from one country, India, and a newcomer in two others, England and Pakistan. He also has lived in New York frequently and for increasingly longer stays. He understands how the world's citizens try to make sense of one another. The diversity of his birthplace endows him with prophecy for a 21st century trying to accommodate the tense differences between peoples. He saw earlier than most of us that, quote, the defining struggle of the new age will be between terrorism and extremism. He is especially equipped to explain that struggle. In his novels, in his journalism, in his criticism, he offers us a vision of the universe with arms open wide enough to gather us all in, if only we will act on our most noble of human instincts. The world he creates includes rather than excludes, and the lessons of his homeland offer truths for the world at large. As he writes of India in Imaginary Homelands, for a nation of 700 million to make any kind of sense, it must base itself firmly on the concept of multiplicity, of plurality and tolerance, of devolution and decentralization wherever possible. There can only be one way, religious, cultural, or linguistic, of being Indian. That way is let difference reign. In this celebration, it's this celebration of difference that offers us a way for the 21st century. It helps us focus on the important things. As Rushdie has put it, we must agree on what matters. Kissing in public, bacon sandwiches, disagreement, cutting-edge fashion, literature, generosity, water, a more equitable distribution of the world's resources, movies, music, freedom of thought, beauty, love. So let us agree on what matters. Salman Rushdie matters. His work matters. He helps us identify the important things. We are greatly honored to have him at the University of Kansas.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's nice to finally make it to the former home of William S. Burroughs and Dorothy. We wonder how they would have got on. Actually, I think on the basis of half a day's exploration, Kansas probably has grounds for a lawsuit against L. Frank Baum, who describes it as gray. Everything was gray. If you remember, the land was gray, the sky was gray, even the people were gray. I've definitely seen some other colors today. Anyway, it's very nice of you to come out in such numbers to listen to a writer speak. There is no reason why writers should be able to do this. And, you know, in a while you may come to agree with that. In fact, this whole business of writers coming out to talk to people interested in their work and to explore their ideas like this is a relatively recent thing. It didn't always happen. It was certainly, if not invented, certainly popularized enormously by Charles Dickens, who did it a great deal. And Dickens had a way of having inventions that caught on. One of his other inventions, Christmas, turned out to be quite popular. Anyway, Dickens would go around doing gigs like this and performing scenes from his books with great animation, doing all the voices of all the characters, including the female ones. And the death of Little Nell was one of his tour de force, and it appeared not to matter that he was bearded. But anyway, he did this so much that, in fact, in the end, it damaged his health. And after his last tour in the United States, he went back to England not very well, and soon after that died. So the moral of the story is that some writers are good at this, but it kills them. So here I am, risking my life. Yes, I guess not for the first time. To talk about some of these themes coming out of my books, and I just wanted to mention that the thing probably most asked of any writer about their work is the question, how autobiographical is it? And I just wanted to mention to you that there is a right and a wrong answer to this question. The wrong answer to this question goes like this. It goes, well, it's not really autobiographical. I suppose it's a little bit autobiographical. I use things that happened to me or that I read about and things that happened to other people I knew, and I kind of jumbled them all up, and then I made some stuff up and added it together, and that's it ends up like that. And it's fiction. This has the merit of being true, but it is the wrong answer. See? The right answer is it's completely autobiographical. Everything that happened in this book happened either to me or to close friends or family members. This is the only answer that will satisfy the questioner. So if there's any writers out there, just give you a tip. It's completely autobiographical. Everything. With my last novel, I had this problem that, there's a novel about a man who's been sexually abused as a child and who almost murders his sleeping wife and small son, and believes himself possibly to be a serial murderer. And when the novel came out, every journalist said to me, "So is it autobiographical?" and for the record, my answer was no. The other problem that happens to writers, particularly if you've had even the most modest degree of success, is that people want to be characters in your books. And the fact that they have not met you does not deter them. So I remember when my novel Midnight's Children was published, and I went to India and I was talking about it in Bombay to an audience. And after it, a lady came up to me, rather beautiful, sort of my age, beautiful, with a fan, very grand, very bejeweled. And she smacked me with her fan. Whack. She said, "Naughty boy, you put me in your book. Never mind, I forgive you." See? and I'm saying, "Madam, who the hell are you?" And so then she identifies herself and says that obviously she is such and such character in the book. And I keep trying to say to her, "But look, this is actually, you have to accept, this is the first time we've ever met." And she says, "I don't know why you're still going on about it. I've already forgiven you." Sometimes, even more tragically, the person who wants to be in your book is right and actually is in your book. And this also happened to me with Midnight's Children. A man came up to, in Midnight's Children, the narrator, Salim, has some boyhood friends. in his neighborhood in Bombay. And one or two of those friends I based, or anyway stole characteristics from people who were boyhood friends of mine. And in particular, there's a character in it who's called Hair Oil. And the reason he's called Hair Oil is because he's unusually neat, and his hair is always neatly oiled and parted, and he's, you know, for a young boy in Bombay, he's always clean and so on. Anyway, Hair Oil. So this man comes up to me in Bombay when the book comes out, and he says, "Hello, Salman, I'm Hair Oil." And I thought this was strange for many reasons. First of all, indeed, he was my old boyhood friend who I had not seen for a long time, on whom I had based the character. But as a child, he had never been known by that nickname. You know, that was a nickname I made up for the book. And I thought how weird it is that your boyhood friend comes up to you and identifies himself to you by the name of a fictional character. Even stranger, and this is the sad bit, was that he'd lost all his hair. So this is, you know, the fact is that, of course, books do come out in part of the writer's life and experience, but not in that very literalist, direct way. I mean, I would not be the writer that I am had it not been for a number of events in and around my life. For example, I was born 8 weeks before the independence of India. And actually, parenthetically, I was probably given the subject of Midnight's Children, which deals with that, by a joke that my parents used to tell. You know how your parents have jokes that they tell over and over again, and which involve you, and how funny are they? You know, they may be a little bit funny the first time, but certainly the 1,001st time they're less funny. And my parents' joke went like this, that Salman was born and 8 weeks later the British ran away. Implying a causal connection between these events, and ha-ha, I thought. But, you know, as it turned out, I had very good reason to be grateful to them for that joke, because first of all, they told it so much that it went in very deep and I remembered it. And secondly, when I finally came round to writing that book, it occurred to me that there didn't need to be an 8-week gap, that I could actually make it, you know, the same moment, and that would be, you know, the child is born and the British run away, and that would be better. And so really, the given of Midnight Children arose out of that family joke. And, you know, I guess I owe them my thanks. They're dead, but still. And it wasn't funny, but still. Thank you. So you see, that's the way in which a writer's life can sometimes give material to his work, and not only in that small way, but in the larger way, that if you're born as I was in the immediate aftermath of not just the independence of India, but also the partition into the states of India and Pakistan, if you're born in the immediate aftermath of the huge upheaval and colossal slaughter that took place at that time, when hundreds of thousands, I mean, we'll probably never know the real number, but hundreds of thousands of people were killed on both sides of the partition. You grow up in the aftermath of that, and it shapes how everybody thinks about everything, and therefore it shapes how you think about everything. And the idea of frontiers and borderlines, and what it does to the world to have these lines drawn on maps, and what are the human consequences of that, become a very important part of one's subject. And in this new novel, Shalimar the Clown, I talk about one particular bit of the consequences of that, which is what happened in Kashmir. Kashmir was not directly ruled by the British. It was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, and the partition treaty allowed him to choose which side he wanted to join, and he was in the strange position of being a Hindu Maharaja with a largely Muslim population, and he didn't know what to do, so he dithered for a long time, unacceptably long time. And in the end, what happened is that the Pakistanis decided to try and force the issue by sending across the border irregular forces, not in uniform, but probably some of them were soldiers, others were armed tribals, and to try and make a land grab, as it were. And at that point, the Maharaja, with the courage of his blood, fled. And the Pakistani leadership, the Kashmiri leadership at that time asked the Indian army to come in to defend them. And so the Indian army arrived to defend them against the incursion, and there followed the first Battle of Kashmir, as a result of which the state was partitioned, and it still is, broadly speaking, on those lines, where about the northern one-third is held by Pakistan and the southern two-thirds by India, including the main valley of Kashmir. And now there runs through the middle of this beautiful place the scar of the so-called line of control, the ceasefire line, on either side of which there are gigantic armed forces, 900,000 Indian troops, 700,000 Pakistani troops, and now in the last couple of decades on the Pakistani side also large numbers of jihadi terrorists. It transformed the life of this part of the world, the drawing of that line on that map. And so, of course, that became a very big part of my subject, the subject of history in general, the subject of how history impinges on the lives of individuals. And it seemed to me that there were literary implications for this. And how shall I explain this? It's that there is something in the art of the novel, there is something that wants to be provincial. The novel wants to be about 5 girls trying to find husbands in a vicarage in Yorkshire. You know, it wants to be about a woman in provincial France unhappy with her boring husband who decides to have an affair. You know, it doesn't want to be about the whole damn planet. You know, and yet, if you have the kind of life that I've had, you begin to think that history and private life are getting to be very difficult to separate now. You know, in the time of Jane Austen, she could write Pride and Prejudice, she could write about the desires of the Bennet sisters to get their husbands without really referring to the fact that the Napoleonic Wars were going on at the same time. And the function of soldiers, the function of the British Army in the novels of Jane Austen is to look cute at parties, you know, in their red uniforms. You know, and I mean, that's a function, you know, I mean, I don't deny. But Napoleon Bonaparte seemed not to be part of their project. Seducing girls was what they were up to, according to Jane. And the point I'm making is not in some way to criticize her, but to point out that she was able to do this because at that time, which is not so very remote from our time, the distance between public life and private life was so great that she didn't need to make reference to the Napoleonic Wars. They did not impinge on the lives of her characters. And she could fully and profoundly explain the lives of her characters with no reference to the public sphere at all. And in 200 years, that has really changed, I think, because I think now history and private life rub up against each other every day. And this has always been evident in poor countries, because I think affluence, wealth, forms a kind of cushion, a kind of buffer zone between the individual and public affairs. And when that doesn't exist, you know, when there isn't that cartilage, so to speak, you know, the bones rub up against each other much harder, and you begin to see the pain of history and its impact on private life. And now I think even the wealth and affluence of the rich bits of the world is no longer a cushion against the reality that history now attacks our lives in very dramatic and daily ways. And what does this mean for literature? Because, again, probably at the root of the novel is the idea expressed 2,000 years ago by Heraclitus that character is destiny. Or to put it more precisely, a man's ethos, his way of being in the world, is his daimon, that's to say, the thing he is destined to be. character cannot be destiny in a world in which history intrudes so brutally. And to put it at its bluntest, when those planes flew into those tall buildings and thousands of people died, it did not matter if they were good or bad people. It did not matter how they had conducted their lives or what choices they had made. Their characters were not their destiny. Something else now can be our destiny. That's to say, destiny can shape character or can shape our lives, not just the other way around. Now, to an extent, that was always true. I mean, there's obviously always been the eruption of the random into private life, the eruption of violence into private life, but it just seems to have extra relevance right now in the world in which we now live. That's something which, if you grew up in the aftermath of the partition, in the aftermath or at the beginning of the crisis in Kashmir and so on, you couldn't escape that. I mean, partition changed my family life. My family got split right down the middle. Half my family went to Pakistan, the other half, including my own parents, stayed in India. And after that, you had to cross this very contentious international border just in order to see your relatives. And what you saw as time passed was how different they were getting. India and Pakistan in 1947 were really the same place with a line drawn through it. Now they're really very much not the same place. They're very unlike each other. And to watch that change happening, to watch people growing apart, to watch their concepts changing, and for each of them to be developing a stereotype of the other that they could dislike, has been a worrying thing to watch happening. What else do you get from biography? Well, one of the things you get, in my case, is a certain relationship to language. I mean, I grew up as what was called an English medium kid. That means I went to school in India in schools in which the medium of instruction was English. And most of the fee-paying, the good schools were like this because they had been left over from the imperial times, and many of them were mission foundations. I mean, for instance, I went to the cathedral school, which, as its name suggests, was connected to the cathedral, and had been founded by an Anglo-Scottish education society. People who don't have the money to send their children to these schools send them to Hindi medium schools where the level of education is not nearly so good. So immediately from the language you speak, there arises all kinds of things, including class distinction, regionalism, resentments, all sorts of things. In Bombay alone, Bombay in the 50s and 60s used to be a larger state. It's now been partitioned into two states, Maharashtra and Gujarat. But in those days, it was a single state in which the language issue became crucial. Did you speak Marathi or Gujarati? That became a political badge. And in the end, that's what resulted in the partition of the state into the two states. But you had to be multilingual. So I was educated in English. My mother tongue was Urdu. The lingua franca of North India is Hindi. The regional languages are Marathi and Gujarati. And that's just the first 5 languages spoken in Bombay. Then, of course, because Bombay is a magnet and people come from all over the place, you have many other languages which are spoken there. The languages of South India, Konkani, Kannada, Tamil. So everybody has to speak, to some extent, more than one language. I mean, actually, the street slang of Bombay, which is called Bombaya, is a kind of mixture of all these things. If you remember the street language spoken in the movie Blade Runner, which was partly English and partly Japanese and partly, Venusian, that's the language spoken on the streets of Bombay. And people from elsewhere in India find it very amusing. And, of course, people from Bombay find the rest of India contemptible. In that sense, it's not unlike the relationship between New York and the United States. I mean, wasn't it a strange moment when New York suddenly became beloved of the United States in the aftermath of 9/11? And actually, one of the things that I got great comfort from was when everybody went back to being rude to each other. I thought that's, what was all this politeness? This after you, no after you stuff. We love New York. No, you don't. And now, at the moment at which everybody started being nasty again, I really thought people had begun to get over it and get their groove back. So sorry, I don't know where that came from. Just to say that the city and the hinterland are often not like each other. You know, the French don't like Paris very much, and the British have great suspicions about London. Yes, India has a very complicated relationship with Bombay, most of it negative. So I got that too, and that gave me a very good way to understand all these other cities that I showed up in. But language, that language project, how to find a way to write in English that felt like that maelstrom of languages. You know, how to find an English that had that sense of linguistic multitudes in it. You know, that became a question that I asked myself and tried to answer because of listening to the language of the streets in which I grew up. And so, yes, of course, that was autobiographical. You know, so these are the ways in which a writer's life shapes his work, not in terms of his direct experience. Another way, for instance, is the question of storytelling. Now, I've always thought, putting on my Western hat, if you like, that something happened in the English novel around the period of high modernism, around the period of Joyce and Beckett and so on, which was a split between what came to be known as the literary novel and what came to be known as popular fiction. And the split was precisely about the subject of storytelling, that the modernist novel could do everything in terms of characterization, formal innovation, linguistic beauty, all that, but it often forgot to have a powerful narrative engine in it. Meanwhile, over here in popular fiction, there were often really powerful page-turning narrative engines, but almost nothing else. You know, no characters, they couldn't write, etc. Probably the best, or should I say worst, current example of this is the Da Vinci Code, which is I mean, do not start me on the Da Vinci Code, because if I ever had to vote for the worst novel ever written, it would not be a hard decision. And you see, you guys laugh, but many of you will have read it. And all I can say is shame on you. A novel so bad that it gives bad novels a bad name. Anyway, let's just put that over here. But what I really wanted to do from the beginning was to try and show that this separation away of storytelling from literature was a false division. And there was no reason for that to occur, and that in fact it was kind of a historical mistake that it had happened, and it was necessary to put it back. And I thought that partly because of growing up in a country in which stories were everywhere as the way in which people understood their lives. Because in India, you know, what we would call mythology, the Hindu mythology is not mythology, it's alive. And people use it every day to help them interpret their lives. You know, they try and, if something happens to them, they actually often see the event in the context of something from the tradition of the stories of the Hindu tradition, and they use that as a way of understanding. So stories are used in a very daily, hands-on way as the method by which people experience their own reality and understand it. And that led me at another point to understand that, Indian or not, one of the things that distinguishes human beings is that we are storytelling animals. That we are, in fact, the only creature on the planet, as far as we know, that tells itself stories in order to understand itself. If there is a great dolphin literature, it has not yet been translated, and so it is difficult to judge it. So that made me feel that there is something essential about us, something fundamental about human beings that is storytelling, that is about the telling of stories. And so that makes it even more important to put storytelling at the center of one's literary project. And the kind of storytelling that I found myself being attracted to had something to do with the tradition in India of the oral story. The oral storytelling is still very much alive in certain parts of India, in particular in the south. This is partly to do with low literacy levels and so on. But anyway, oral storytellers gather big crowds. And if you go and listen to them, you notice something very interesting, which is they do not observe the classical rules of how you should tell a story. These rules are probably best expressed by the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, when he tells Alice to start at the beginning, go on until you reach the end, and then stop. This, what one might call caterpillarism, is not the technique used by the Indian oral storyteller. Instead, he uses a technique of endless digression. That he will start by a story which may begin, let's say, in the classical tradition, but he will immediately divert from that and say that it reminds him of something going on in the country at the time, maybe a political episode. That will in turn be interrupted because it reminds him of a story about his great-aunt. Then he'll sing a song about it, and then he'll do a little dance, and then he'll tell you some dirty jokes. And at some point, he'll circle back around to the story he began with. But the point is there's about 5 or 6 different narrative balls in the air at any time. And it sounds almost random. But then I thought, let's think about this another way. Let's think about this in terms of this being a very, very old form that has survived for, certainly hundreds and almost certainly thousands of years. And the point about the oral storyteller is that he knows when he has lost his audience, because they either get up and walk away or they start throwing things. You know? So everything that the oral storyteller does is designed to keep the audience listening and to hold its interest and to satisfy it. And it then struck me, supposing then that this way of telling the story, the anti-caterpillar technique of telling the story, which is supposed to be more complicated, not less complicated, it would conventionally be thought to be harder to understand, is actually the best way of keeping the audience listening. That actually it's more enjoyable than the beginning to end stuff. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, because if that's true, then there's a real clue there. That this kind of narrative juggling, this playfulness of form, is actually more likely to create enjoyment than simplicity and purity, if you like, of form. And I then thought, well, how do you do that in a written down version? You can't obviously do it exactly the same way, but that was one of the questions I began to ask myself, and a lot of my writing has come out of that. And probably the other thing that I should mention in terms of what I was given by the accidents of my life in terms of subject was the question of religion. Now, I myself am mercifully free of religion. This is the great gift that my parents gave me, that they were not religious. And at the time I thought it was just normal, and now once again, as with the bad joke, I have to express gratitude. As a result, I never had any doubts about evolution theory. I gather there are parts of Kansas where the Big Bang did not take place. And actually, it seems to me that some of the exponents of the theory of intelligent design are probably the best argument themselves against the truth of Darwin's theory. Proving that evolution can sometimes go backwards, creating them. Odd, strange word, intelligent design, for what in fact is a kind of stupidity, but that's a... sorry, that was a digression. But I digress, see above oral storytelling. Religion, whether you are religious or not in India, is something you have to reckon with if you're going to write about India, because everyone else is religious. And the best illustration of this has to do with a newspaper article I read many years ago now about an Indian anthropologist who had embarked for a very long period of time on what now seems to me the deranged project of counting the total number of deities in India. By which I mean not just the very famous kind of superstar above the title Tom Cruise deities, but also all the tiny little deities of Woodland Grove and Little Stream and so on. And after this wasted life, he came up with the astonishing figure of 300 million gods. Right? Imagine this. This is the population of the United States in divine form. Right? Now, the population of India today is just over 1 billion human beings. So that means one god per 3.3 human beings. This is a lot of gods. This is what you might call a personal service godhead. Like going to private school. It's very small classes. And not just that, but when I was growing up in India in the 50s, the figure we were taught for the population of India then was only 500 million. The population has doubled since in the last half century. Now, you have to assume that the divine population has remained reasonably stable. Divine birth control must be a bit better than the humankind. And so if there were still 300 million gods back then, that meant that there were 300 million gods to 500 million people, an even more spectacular figure. And if you then project that population curve backwards, you realize that it was probably only in the 1940s when, for the first time, the human population of India exceeded the supernatural population. Now, what this does to a writer for whom India is a big part of his subject is to change his description of reality. Because if that is what is real, then you have to take that into account when you're writing. You can't exclude such a significant part of the population of a country just because it happens not to exist. So, since when did non-existence become an exclusion point for anything? I mean, all kinds of things don't exist. Like George Bush's brain. Anyway, sorry, that was another digression. We'll put that over here with the Da Vinci Code. Anyway, so oddly, I thought of religion in that way as something that I had to take on as a part of the explanation. But I never thought about myself as a writer about religion. It seemed to me to be just one of the things, in the stew pot. And then I guess the biggest damage done to me by what happened to the Satanic Verses was that I became characterized for many people as a writer about religion, which I still don't think I am. However, it is getting to be difficult to... I would really love never to mention the word again, religion, but unfortunately now it seems as if it's coming after us all. And if so it better be a fish that we consider frying, because otherwise it may end up frying us. And I don't just mean radical Islam, by the way. I think there's some difficulties right here. So the question then, just since we've got onto the subject of what happened to the Satanic Verses, the question then that I think that dramatized, but that in a way that I was thinking about before then and have gone on thinking about since, is what is it about politicians and writers? What is it about people of power and writers? Because after all, the amount of power that writers have is by comparison with the amount of power that people of power have, relatively small. And I came to think that it has to do with the question of truth and lies. It has to do with how you tell the story of the world you live in and who should have power over that story. And I think there's a sense in which politicians and writers are fighting for the same territory, because they're both trying to offer descriptions of the world. They're both trying to say the world is like this. The politician, of course, says it for venal reasons. That's to say, vote for me because the world is like this. Whereas the writer tends to say, oh, no, it isn't, and has a more oppositional relationship to that, to any orthodox, official description of reality. But it means that that issue of how you describe what is the case is something which is in contention between power and literature, and is one of the reasons, I think, why tyrants so often want to lock up writers and silence those voices. And I think that, in the end, when I thought about what happened to the Satanic Verses, I came to think that that really is what it had been about, that it had been a battle about the subject of who has power over the story, over the so-called grand narrative. We all live inside stories. Nation, that's a story. Family, that's a story. Religion, that's a story. These are the grand narratives inside which we live. And the question is whether we are able to shape them and reshape them or not. And if we can reshape our ideas about the stories inside which we live to suit the changing needs of our time, that is a description of freedom. And if we cannot do that, if people try and prevent us from reshaping those stories to suit the times in which we live, that is a description of unfreedom. And that's why it becomes important. It becomes important whether or not you like novels, or whether you like, my novels. No, you're very foolish if you don't. I understand that there's a reason for having other people's books in bookshops. I just about understand it, I think it's regrettable, but true. Anyway. But that was the battle. And if you wanted to have a serious discussion about it, that would be the discussion to have. Unfortunately, what happened to the book was something which, had it not been unfunny, would actually have been quite funny. Let's put it like this. The basic question, should you kill people because you don't like their books, is, in my view, relatively simple to answer. And my answer would be no. Although in the case of Dan Brown, one might... No, not really. Not really. Even Dan Brown must live. Preferably not write, but live. Sorry, he keeps jumping off that table over there. He's down. Anyway, the funny bits, you see, were that beyond that simple question of whether you should kill people for what they write, there were a series of very absurd moments. For example, quite soon after, how shall I put it, after the excrement hit the ventilation system, there was an interview on British television with one of the main leaders of the protests in England against the Satanic Verses, and a Muslim gentleman from Bradford in Yorkshire, in the north of England. And the journalists asked him whether he had read the Satanic Verses, and he said no. He said, you see, it is not necessary to walk in the gutter to understand that it contains filth. I thought, good point. And then the journalist said, but Mr. Rushdie this is not his first novel. In fact, it's his fifth book, and he's written a number of non-fiction pieces and so on. And have you ever read anything he's written? And this gentleman said, very sweetly actually, rather innocently, said, no, he said, you see, books are not my thing. And at that point, I understood the nature of the conflict, right? That, on the one hand, people for whom books were not their thing, and the other hand, people for whom they were. I also thought one of the ways of defining what happened had to do with comedy. That's to say, one of the things not often said then or now about the Satanic Verses is that it is in large part a comic novel, and that comedy gets up people's noses much more than anything else, and that you could describe what happened as a battle between people with a sense of humor and people without one. The other thing that happened, I remember, some years later when things got easier and when you could say the excrement had been cleaned off the ventilation system, when I met this young man in England again, a young Muslim man, with his English girlfriend, and he started making a kind of fan speech, and she stopped him and said, no, you have to confess. And so under pressure from her, he confessed that at the worst time of the demonstrations against the Satanic Verses, he had been one of the conveners of those demonstrations in a particular part of England. And he said, but it's all right, I'm an atheist now. So I said this was progress. And he said, and anyway, then recently I read your book and I can't see what the fuss was about. So I said, yes, asshole, but you were the fuss, you know? So you see, funny except not funny. And actually, of course, in a kind of deep irony, this has always been exactly the way that I've liked to write, on the edge of funny and not funny. And then, so my basic description of what happened to me is that it was a bad Salman Rushdie novel, one that I would have been embarrassed to have written and just had to live instead. And since, I guess, what was thrown up by all that was the subject of free speech, I should just tell you one thing about the way in which, well, obviously I had to learn a lot of lessons about free speech because you don't bother to think a lot about free speech when everybody has it. It's when somebody tries to stop it that you feel like somebody's turning off the air supply and suddenly it's difficult to breathe, and you suddenly want to make the point that it's quite useful to have air to breathe. And that's kind of what happened to me. And I learned a number of lessons, not least by this episode that I'll tell you about, which is that there was a film made about me in those days in Pakistan. The film was called International Guerrillas, and its heroes were what we would now call jihadis, Al-Qaeda terrorists. And the villain was me. And the plot was that they were supposed to kill me, and that would be the happy ending. They spent the film trying to do this. And the interesting thing about the film is the me character was living in what looked like great luxury in an island in the Philippines. All novelists have these. And he was being protected by what looked very like the Israeli Secret Service. This is a service that Mossad offers to all novelists. And he was drinking, bourbon from the bottle, and in his other hand he usually had either a whip or a cutlass, and he would torture people with it idly because that's the kind of guy I am. And worst of all, he was shown in each scene wearing an almost infinite sequence of luridly colored safari suits. Lime safari suits, vermilion safari suits, aubergine safari suits. And the camera loved the safari suits. It would invariably start at his feet and pan up. So there was a lot of suit, and I must say I thought the fashion insult was worst of all. Anyway, at a certain point in the film, they captured one of the international guerrillas and brought him to the island of the Philippines. and tied him up between two palm trees, like this. And then I showed up with my bottle of Jim Beam and my whip and my cutlass. And I had my way with him, for a while, trifling with him, because that was fun. And then when I'd slaked my evil bloodlust, I said, in the only genuinely funny line in the film, I said to the Israeli Secret Service, I said, take him away and read to him from the Satanic Verses all night. Well, of course, he cracked completely. He says, not that, anything but that, So, anyway, at the end of this film, I did get killed. I didn't get killed by them. I didn't get killed by the international guerrillas. I got killed by God. Thunderbolt from the sky. Personally fried by the Almighty, See, there's dignity in that, I thought. Anyway, this movie, right? It comes out, and I'm making light of it, but as you can see, it's a fairly unpleasant film. And they bring it to England, and they apply for a certificate to show it. And it's called the British Board of Film Classification, the BBFC, refused it a certificate because they had taken legal advice, and they'd been told that the film was clearly very, very defamatory. And that if they gave it a certificate, then they would become party to the defamation, which would mean that I could not only sue the filmmakers, I could also sue them. And so they said no certificate, and they banned the film, and there was me fighting a free speech battle, being defended by an act of censorship. But it was a very strange moment, because, of course, the film was horrible, and it was difficult to know what to do. But in the end, I took a lot of advice and eventually took the decision. I wrote a letter to the board, formally giving up my right of legal recourse and saying that they should not deny the film a certificate on those grounds, because I was assuring them that I would not sue either the filmmakers or them, and if that was the objection, then that should not be seen as an objection. And in one of the weirdnesses of my life, my intervention on the behalf of this film meant that it was indeed given a certificate. And the producers went to Bradford, home of the chap for whom books were not his thing, home also of the largest Muslim community in England, and booked the biggest theatre in Bradford to show the film. And nobody went, And you know why nobody went? Rotten movie, And it didn't matter what people thought of me. Nobody wants to spend their $10 seeing a rotten movie, when they can go and see one with Tom Cruise in it instead. So this gave me, and I thought to myself then that if the film had remained banned, it would have become an incredibly hot ticket. The videotape would have become a really covetable thing, and it would have circulated with excitement and the kind of frisson of contraband, and its power would have been enormously increased. The fact that it was out there in the light of day and everybody could see that it was rubbish meant that it disappeared within a few days and has never been seen again. And it struck me that there was, in microcosm, a very fine demonstration of the free speech position, which is that you should let people say the worst they have to say. Because actually most people, those feelings do not, those sentiments, those ideas do not disappear if they are gagged. They just go underground, where in many ways they can have more influence than when they're out in the light of day, where they can be debated against, dismissed, ridiculed, laughed at, not gone to see, commercially damaged, where they can be beaten. You can't beat them if they're not out in the light of day to be faced. And to put it simply, if it's shit, people can tell by the smell. And I'm sorry for that elevated metaphor. But anyway, just to conclude all this, the way I have come to sum all this up for myself about this curious business of what writing is in the world now and what it should try to do and why it annoys people and so on. I came to think of it in terms of a brief paragraph in a novel by Saul Bellow, The Dean's December. A very peripheral paragraph in a way. The Dean's December is about an American academic from Chicago, a dean, Albert Cord, who's married to a Romanian lady, and there's a moment in the novel where, for reasons of her family, they have to go to Romania. And this is Romania, before the change, so Ceausescu's Romania, very bleak and brutal, and it's winter, and the dean is standing at the window of his wife's family's apartment, and it's cold and horrible and Romanian, and he's looking out at a park which is frozen with leafless trees, etc., and he hears a dog barking in the distance. A dog beginning to bark and going on barking with greater and greater and greater insistence, and seemingly unstoppably, inconsolably barking. And because this is a dog in a Saul Bellow novel, the dean is obliged to speculate on what the dog is saying in his barking. And he decides in the end that the dog's barking is a protest about the limitations of dog experience. Right? And that what the dog is trying to say in his loud, interminable barking is, for God's sake, open the universe a little more, which is a beautiful line and very Bellovian line. Open the universe a little more. And I remember when I read it, I thought, thinking about the art of the novel, I thought, that's as good a description of the job as there is. And that all the writers that I've ever admired, not to say loved, have had that desire to increase by some small amount the sum total of what it is possible for us to know and to think and to feel and to experience. Let's say they have tried to open the universe, and that the way in which they try to do it is not by sitting in the safe middle ground. You can't push the frontiers out unless you go to the frontiers and push against them,